Jewish text began at Mount Sinai, right? At Mount Sinai, God gave the written and the oral Torah. Those of you who have been for a while know it's not that simple. The written Torah wasn't all given at Mount Sinai. In fact, some of it might have been given before and much of it might have been given after, right? But one thing is clear, Hashem gave the written Torah to the Jewish people. And the 5 books of Moses, the Chumash, right, are we believe to be word for word, letter for letter, the word of Hashem. Right, that's the book. You have it in your packet. Right, the Chumash, made up of the 5 books: Bereshis, Shmos, Vayikra, Bamidbar, and Devarim. In English/Latin, those are Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. This past week, if you went to synagogue, we finished the book of Bamidbar, right, the book of Numbers, and next week we're starting the book of Deuteronomy, the book of Devarim. Okay. So that was given at Mount Sinai. Those 5, or again, whether it was given at Mount Sinai or not, word for word, letter for letter, we understand the Chumash, the 5 books, to be word for word, letter for letter, the word of Hashem, given to the Jewish people. Now, we've mentioned, for those of you who haven't been here, you can look at your packets and see on page 2 where we proved this from, but that the written Torah makes no sense with an oral Torah, right? That if you don't have an oral Torah, there are verses in the Torah that don't make any sense. There are ideas that come up in the Torah that are not explained. There are verses that seem to contradict each other. There are big gaps of information that are missing. There are things that you and I know about Judaism, and for thousands of years people have all known about Judaism, but they're not mentioned in the written Torah. Where do we all know all that from? From the oral Torah. Where did the oral Torah come from? It was given by Hashem, by God, to Moshe, right, on Mount Sinai. And throughout the time that Hashem was giving him the Torah, every time Hashem would say, write this down word for word, letter for letter, in the Chumash, he would say, let me explain that to you. And that explanation was the oral Torah. Because the oral Torah is every bit as divine as the written Torah. What was the difference between them? The written Torah was written, and the oral Torah was very good, oral. Right? We got some sharp thinkers here. Yeah.
How is it scientifically possible that Moses remembered everything?
Okay.
It's so much.
Yeah, good. So the answer, there's several different answers to that question, right? Most of the time the question people ask is, how could it have gotten passed down from generation to generation without mistakes? That we've discussed, and we can discuss again another time if you want to. How did Moshe, who was told all of this mostly on Mount Sinai for 40 days and 40 nights, when he came down, how did he remember the whole thing? So first of all, we do understand that this was somewhat supernatural, right? That Moshe, every day for the 40 days and 40 nights he was on Mount Sinai, learned the whole Torah himself. He worked really hard, worked through it, and then he would forget it all at the end of the day. Until on the 40th day, Hashem gave it to him as a present, okay, whatever that means. So we do understand that there was a supernatural element to the fact that Moshe knew the whole Torah. Right, but the other thing that we've said, and again, we've explained this in great detail, to say it quickly, is that the oral Torah was really made up of principles, right? Now, you and I, like we look at their 2,711 pages of the Talmud, and we say, how could anybody know that, all of it, right, backwards and forwards in their head? The truth is there are plenty of people in the world, I know plenty, but there are people in the world who do that. There are people in the world that you could ask them any question in the Talmud. There's somebody who lives here in Jerusalem, right? People go to him and they'll ask him, how many times does this word appear in the Talmud, in the 2,711 pages of the Talmud? And he can tell you, right? Obviously he has a photographic memory, and he's also worked very, 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 very hard to memorize it. So there are people who know all of it. But what Moshe knew, and we're going to talk about this today, what Moshe knew was the principles behind what's written in the oral Torah, what's written in the written down form of the oral Torah, right? That's less information, because once you know the principles, then lots of cases come out of that, right? So if you knew, right, like again, in secular law, this is also true. If you really get how property law works, like you really get it, you understand the fundamentals, and you not just know, okay, I memorized this case and I memorized that case, but you really get it. So then somebody come to you and say, what about this case? And you can tell them the answer, right? So that's what Moshe had. Moshe, when he came down from the Torah, from Mount Sinai, he knew, no problem, he knew the oral Torah, meaning he knew all the principles involved, okay? So then, right, so Moshe came down the mountain, he knew the whole written Torah, he knew the whole oral Torah, he handed out written copies of the written Torah, He told everybody, he started teaching everybody the oral Torah, right? That got passed down from generation to generation. We've discussed how, despite the fact that if we would play the game of telephone, and I would say something to, what's your name? Olivia. And she would whisper it to the person next to her and go all the way in the room, all the way on the room to, what's your name? To Rachel. We would all laugh because it would have nothing, it would sound nothing like, by the time Rachel said it would sound nothing like what I said to Olivia. We've discussed, we're not going to go through it again now, but we've discussed why a rational person could still believe that the oral Torah was passed on from generation to generation in an unbroken chain in a way that nothing got lost, right? We can talk about that another time if you're interested. Okay, now we talked last time about the oral Torah got passed down orally from generation to generation, was not written down, right? The way it worked was there would be certain people in the generation who were the experts in the oral Torah, right? And what learning Torah would be is that people would go to the study hall, the people who learn oral, the experts would sit in the middle, and they would discuss the oral Torah that they had received from the previous generation, right? They would discuss it, they'd ask questions, they'd say, what about this, and what about that, and what about these two things which seem to contradict each other? Everybody else would sit in bleachers around them, and they'd listen in, and they'd say, oh, why do you think he said that? And why do you think he holds that and he holds that? Why are they arguing, right? And they would discuss it and they would be taking notes, right? And then those students would hopefully become the leaders, or some of them would become the leaders of the next generation. And then the next generation, they would be the ones sitting in the middle. And the students would be sitting around taking notes from what they said, right? Now, eventually, as we mentioned last time, this is just a review, we're going to go on after this. Eventually, as we said last time, as the Jews got sent into exile in about the year 180, 200 CE, right? As the Jews were going into exile, we had a big problem. Because if all the Jews are in one place, that's fine. Everybody can sit around and listen to the experts. But what happens if you're going to be in a place where there are no experts? Or you're going to be the only expert, you have no one to discuss it with. So Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi, who was the leader of the time, lived in a place called Tzipori. Did you guys on your trip go donkey riding?
Yeah.
Yeah?
I have gone in the
Okay, so if you've gone donkey riding, right, it's right in the hills there. They show you. You can see Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi's house, right? So right around there, and around the year 200 CE, the Mishnah was written. And we discussed last time what the Mishnah is. The Mishnah is, actually 2 times ago, the Mishnah is 6 sections broken down into 63 volumes, right? And that contains the bare minimum of the oral Torah, right? The bare minimum that you need to know in order to get the fundamentals of the oral Torah. It was written in a way that it's like a code, you got to know how to crack it, right? So still, you have to have people around who can show you how to study the Mishnah and have to explain to you why the Mishnah used this word and why it didn't use that word, right? But the Mishnah was a written form that people could now use as the basis for their study of oral Torah. Okay? Over the next 300 years, we said, people think exile got worse, and therefore, not only did we need the Mishnah, we needed another source that would include all the explanations people had given for the Mishnah over these 300 years. That was called the, anybody remember? Gemara. Very good. And we said that was about 500 CE. And what do we call this book of Mishnah plus Gemara? Talmud. Right? So I brought show and tell last time, and I have even more show and tell this time. Right? This is one volume of the Talmud. What do we call a volume of the Talmud? Anybody remember? A masechta. Masechta means a volume of the Talmud. So I happen to have brought, partially because it's thin and was easy for me to put in my briefcase, right? The one called Rosh Hashanah. What do you think this one's about?
Rosh Hashanah.
Good, Rosh Hashanah, right? It's about the holiday of Rosh Hashanah, among other things. Okay? Now, just again, I showed you this last time. I'll pick a different one this time. In the middle of this page, those of you who are close can see there's a Mem Tuf Nun Yud here, which stands for the word Masnisin, which means our Mishnah. This is a Mishnah, right? From here down to here, right? These about 6 lines. Then it says Gimel Mem. What do you think Gimel Mem stands for?
Gam.
Good, it means Gam, it spells Gam, and it stands for Gemara, right? So the Gemara explaining this Mishnah, these 6 lines of Mishnah, starts here. It's the last 4 lines of this page, Only the middle is the Talmud. We'll talk about it on the outside soon, right? Then all of this is continuing with Gemara on that Mishnah, right? And all of this up until here. This is a very short Gemara compared to what I showed you last time, right? But so there you got almost 2 pages of Gemara explaining 5 or 6 lines of Mishnah, right? So when people say, I'm learning Gemara, if you've ever heard a guy say that, right, I'm learning Gemara, he's really learning Talmud. Right? You can't learn Gemara without learning the Mishnah because the Gemara is an explanation of the Mishnah. But there's so much more Gemara than there is Mishnah that people just refer to it as learning Gemara. Okay? But this then was sealed at this point. The Talmud Bavli, the Babylonian Talmud. Why was it called the Babylonian Talmud?
Babylonians were ruling.
Well, where was it written?
Wasn't it written
In Babylonia. It was written in Babylonia, which is modern day Iran, right? Sorry, modern day Iraq, right? So, and in fact, until recently, there was still a Jewish community in Iraq until the Persian Gulf War. I think there are still a couple Jews in Iraq. But anyway, so at that point, they sealed the Talmud and they said, this is now the source that will be the basis for your study of the oral Torah. It used to be completely oral until we wrote down the Mishnah. By the way, I just brought for you, right? People carried these around. This is one of the 6 orders of the Mishnah. It's all in here, right? Again, you can see the middle is the Mishnah. Around it is commentary. We'll talk about that, right? This is the whole order, the whole Seder called Nezikin, which is about damages, right? So there are 6 of these, make up the whole Mishnah, right? But this only has the Mishnah. It doesn't have the Gemara. This is Mishnah plus Gemara equals Talmud, okay? Fine. So now we have the Mishnah and Gemara. Now, I mentioned this last time. What is the first thing that starts happening when a Jew writes a Jewish text?
People comment on it.
Good. People write commentary on it, right? Where there's text, there's commentary. That is always true, right? So we had the Talmud, and now, after the year 500, the people who would come along and learn Torah, they would learn the Talmud, and then they would write down all of their explanations and their ideas about the Talmud, okay? Now, for the 500 years between 500 and 1,000, unfortunately, persecution was so bad that we don't have many of the writings from that time period. There was a group of people called the Amoraim that almost nobody has heard of, and a group after them called the Gaonim, which means the geniuses, right? That
Do they call themselves that?
I don't think they called themselves that, but they might have, the students, that was the title they gave, like we call our rabbis rabbi, they would call them Gaon, right? So we had that period, and we don't have that many writings from that time. But about the year 1000 started a time period where we have lots of writings from. That was a time period that we today call the Rishonim. Anybody know what the word Rishon means? Good, right? The first ones. Now, they didn't call themselves that, right? But we, in retrospect, now call them that. They really means the early ones. We're going to come to another group called the Acharonim. What does Acharon mean? The last ones. Those are going to be the later people. Right? So the Rishonim relative to the Acharonim were the early ones, right? This was about the period between 1000 and 1500. And you have heard of some of these people, right? I'll give you an example of who some of the Rishonim were. By the way, just to put everything in context, right? The people from the Mishnah period were called a Tana, or in the plural, Tannaim. And the people from the Gemara period were called an Amora, or Amoraim. Tana means a teacher. Amora, what does the word lemor mean? To say, good, right? These were the speakers, because they were speaking out, they were explaining the Mishnah. These were the teachers, and these were the explainers, yeah.
I thought debar means to say or to speak.
You know how in Alaska they have a lot of words for snow? So Jews have a lot of words for talking. Right? So, right, you're 100% correct that the word ledaber also means to speak, and lemur also means to say. Right. Okay, there's another word, lahagid, which also kind of means to speak. Yeah.
Can you repeat what Tannaim means, teacher?
Yes. Right? In Aramaic. Okay. Right? The word Tana means a teacher, and the word Amora means a speaker. Okay? Now, who were the Tannaim? So you've heard of some of them, right? I'll give you some of the Tannaim, just so you can put people in their context, right? You've heard of Hillel? And who was Hillel's study partner? Or his? Shammai, good. And you've heard of Rabbi Akiva? Anybody ever been to Meorot?
Yeah.
To the gravesite of? Good. Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai was from this time period? Right? There was somebody named Rabbi Meir, if you've ever been to his grave. Right? Rabbi Meir, or Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Meir Balanese, that's him. Right? Rabbi Yehuda.
Was Balanese Sephardic?
Who? Who?
Robert Mayer.
So there were not yet Sephardim or Ashkenazim at this point.
Would the Lubavitch be counted as Tannaim?
No. These people lived in about the year between, before 0 up until 200. Right? The Lubavitcher Rebbe lived in the 1980s. Right? So they were about 2,000 years before that. Right? Okay. So those people are all examples of Tannaim. Right? Amoraim, you may have heard of less, but you will still hear of them. Right? People like, there was an Amora called Rav, and Shmuel, and Rabbi Yochanan, and Reish Lakish. Anybody ever hear of him? And Rav Papa, if you've ever heard of him.
Where was the Arizal?
Again, the Arizal also came much later, right? These people, again, the Amoraim all lived prior to the year 500 CE, right? The Arizal lived, I think, in the 1600s, right? 1500s maybe.
That's the same time period as Baal Shem Tov.
Of who? The Baal Shem Tov. The Baal Shem Tov lived in the 1700s, same time the Vilna Gaon lived. Yeah, right. So these people are way back, right? So these people wrote what? And of course, Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi. There's 2 Rabbi Yehudas. What did these people write? The Mishnah, right? And what did these people write? The Gemara, right? Okay, one way, by the way, where was the Mishnah written? I said before, you saw it when you rode your donkeys? Where? In what country? No, the Mishnah was written in Israel, right? The Gemara was written in Babylonia, right? So the Mishnah is written in what language? Hebrew. And the Gemara is written in what language? Aramaic, which is what they spoke in Babylonia, right? Now, interestingly, you see how all these people are called Rabbi? And some of these people are called Rabbi, but some of them are called Rav, right? The reason is anybody who lived in Israel, you could only be called Rabbi if you lived in Israel. At this time period, everybody lived in Israel. At this time period, there were still some people who lived in Israel, but a lot of them, most of them lived in Babylonia. So you will still find some people like Rabbi Yochanan who lived in Israel, but most of them will be people like Rav Papa, right, who lived in Babylonia. And by the way, the 2 people who wrote down the Mishnah, the Gemara, were somebody named Ravina, that was his name, and Rav Ashi. Yeah.
Okay, to answer my question.
Okay.
Today, there are rabbis who live in America.
Yes.
And so how does that go with it?
Yeah, so today the word rabbi doesn't really mean the same thing as what it meant then.
So what's the difference?
There used to be something called, the process of becoming a rabbi is something called smicha, right? Smicha, we loosely translate as ordination, right? It actually doesn't mean that. It actually means leaning, right? Lismoch. Lismoch means to lean on, right? So there's a process whereby somebody could put his hands on somebody's head and lean on him, right? And transfer to him what had been in him, right? Now today we don't do this, right? This process ended a long, long time ago. But back then there was actually something called smicha, right? And that could only be done in the land of Israel. So to become a Rebbe had to be given to me by somebody else who could pass that on to me, right? Once they were in Babylonia, they couldn't do that anymore. Today we just use the word rabbi literally means teacher. So we just use the word rabbi freely and loosely, but it doesn't, because nobody has real smicha today. So therefore, we just use the word. But then they were very particular about only using the word for the people who actually got that smicha.
And there's people like Hillel and Shammai who don't have any prefixes.
Yeah, so there are different explanations to why that is. Also over here you have like Rav and Shmuel, right? One explanation is that they were kind of above the title, right? Like once you give a title, so then what do you do with the people who are like super rabbis? So they didn't even need a title. They were just called by their name, right? Yeah, good questions.
Kind of like that question, and you may have talked about it or will talk about it later. What about like Rashi and Rambam?
Oh, we'll get there. We'll get
You
there.
guys know?
No, well,
Russia's from
yeah, hang on, we'll talk about that. We'll talk about Rashi very soon. Okay? So that's the Tannaim, and then came the Amoraim, right? And now the Gemara has been written, or the Talmud has been written. Now, that's where we were up to. We were talking about, okay, the Talmud has been written, who came next? So these Rishonim. So the Rishonim started in the year 1000, and one of the earliest Rishonim was a man named Rashi, right? Now, trick question, what was Rashi's name?
this is a.
Good. But that, yes, yeah, right. I'll tell you Rashi's name in a minute, right? Also, the Rambam, the Ramban, the Ritva, the Rajba, the Ran, good. Right? Yeah. Now, what do you notice about all these people? Their names all start with R. Big coincidence, right? And they were all Rishonim, right? So why do their names all start with R?
Rabbi.
Good, because they are all acronyms. There was no guy walking around in Rashi, and there was no guy walking in Rambam, right? Rashi's name in Hebrew was Rabbi Shlomo Yitzchaki, right? Where he came from, instead of saying son of, they would just say Yitzchaki, meant from the house of Yitzchak, right? So he was Rabbi Shlomo Yitzchaki. Reish Shin Yud spells Rashi, right? And today in Israel, you do find some people name their daughters Rashi. Interestingly, it's a girl's name, right? But Rashi was not named Rashi. Rashi's name was Shlomo, right? What about the Rambam? Close. Rabbi Moshe ben Maimon, right? So that's why he's called Maimonides in Greek, right? Because his father's name was Maimon. In fact, if you've been to the Rambam's gravesite in Tiberias, across from him is Maimon's gravesite, which is his father, right? Rabbi Moshe ben Maimon Rambam, right? That's where it comes from, right? The Ramban's name was Rabbi Moshe ben Nachman. And that's why he's called Nachmanides in Greek, right? And in Hebrew, Rabbi Moshe ben Nachman.
Why do they have Greek names?
Well, the Greeks also talked a lot about these philosophers, right? We, in yeshivas, right, you wouldn't hear people call them Maimonides or Nachmanides. That's really that's what the Greeks called them, or the Romans called them that in Latin, right? But we call them the Rambam and the Ramban. But in the greater world, it got passed down from the Greeks and the Romans to call them Maimonides and Nachmanides.
Why did the Greeks and Romans decide to take these Jewish philosophers and teach them?
Just like, cultures take the best of each culture's philosophers, right? And there's Western philosophy and medieval philosophy, and the Jews were part of this was part of medieval philosophy. Now they were explaining, they would have said, I'm not a medieval philosopher, I'm a Torah scholar, right? But they were explaining philosophy. And in fact, the Rambam, right, was aware of Aristotle, right? And even discusses Aristotle sometimes, right? So their works are very philosophical sometimes, right? So the greater world was interested in their philosophy. Also, by the way, the Rambam, what was his profession in addition to being a Torah scholar? He was a doctor. In fact, he was the head doctor for the Sultan of Egypt, right? So he was well known throughout the secular world for both his medical and his philosophical contributions. That's why there are a lot of hospitals around North America called Rambam, right? Or Maimonides, right? For those two reasons, right? So that's why all of their names start with R. They are all acronyms, right? But now, again, what these people were doing was commenting on the Torah. They wrote commentaries on the written Torah, they wrote commentaries on the oral Torah, and they wrote philosophical works drawing from things that are in the written and the oral Torah, right? Now, let's just talk for a minute about some other words that you hear and what they are. Okay, so far we've covered what the Tannaim are, who the Amoraim are, what the Rishonim are, and we've talked about the Mishnah, the Gemara, and the Rishonim. Okay, next time we are going to talk more about what the Rishonim did and how that led down to some of these other books I have here, like the books of Jewish law, the Shulchan Aruch, and things like that. But we're going to put this on hold for a minute, right? Remember, those of you who were here, I told you that the Mishnah was the way Rabbi Yehuda Nasi wrote the Mishnah. Is he went around to all those study halls we described, and he said to all the students, everybody give me your notes. And he ended up with so many notes, right, that he didn't know what to do with them, right? They wouldn't all fit into any kind of usable form. Like the Mishnah is 6 volumes of this, right? It would have been at least 60 volumes of this, right? So he had all this information, and he couldn't possibly include it all here. So what he did was, in my image, he cut and pasted the bare essentials, put them in, and left on the cutting floor, so to speak, I'm sure he didn't leave it on the floor, right? But left on the cutting floor all the majority of the oral Torah, right? Now, what happened to that stuff? So everything that was left outside of the Mishnah, we refer to as a brisa or a braita. The word bara in Aramaic means outside. So this is all the oral Torah that was left out of the Mishnah, right? Now, where can I find all of that stuff, right? So first of all, it's often quoted by the Gemara, because the Amoraim, the rabbis of the Gemara period, knew this, even though it wasn't in the Mishnah, and therefore, when they were discussing a certain topic, they could quote a brisa, right, that supports their case, right? So in the Gemara, in the Talmud, you will often find this generation referring to things from this generation that weren't in the Mishnah. Those things are called a brisa, right? Now, there were other collections of brisas. There's something called the Tosefta, right? But one very important word that you will hear a lot, and I'm sure you already have heard, right, that is a collection of this stuff that was left outside the Mishnah, is a midrash, right? A midrash is oral Torah that was not included in the Mishnah, specifically parts of oral Torah that line up with parts of written Torah. So for example, in any given week, you could look on that week's Torah portion, you could open a midrash, and there are different midrashim, different volumes of midrash, and see what does the oral Torah have to say about this verse that I'm reading right now, about this Torah portion that I'm reading right now, right? And not only on the Chumash, on the books of the prophets also, so you could read the midrash on Megillas Esther, or on the book of Ruth, or on the book of Tehillim, or any of that. They all have their midrashim, right? Now, I'll give an example of what a midrash is, right? Anybody know what Avraham, we read about Avraham in the Torah, what was Avraham's father's profession?
He was an idol maker.
Good, he was an idol maker, and what happened?
Abraham smashed all his idols.
Good, right? One day, Avraham's father's name was Terach. He went out to lunch. He said, Avram, you watch the store, right? And watch all the idols. While he was gone, Avraham smashed all the idols except for the biggest one. He took the stick that he had used to smash all the idols and put it in the hand of the big idol, right? When his father came back, his father saw all of his idols were smashed except for one. He said, what happened? He said, you're not going to believe it, Dad. There was this big fight. They all were hitting each other with sticks. And the big one broke all the other ones. And his father said, what did his father say?
That he say they're just idols.
Yeah, don't be silly, little Abe. They're just idols. They can't do that. And what did Avraham say?
Why do you pray to them?
He took out his thumb and he said, then why do you pray to them if they can't do anything, right? And kids learn that midrash, and lots of people have heard that, right? Where in the Chumash does it say that story? It doesn't. That's part of the oral Torah. But if you open the midrash to the part where it talks about Abraham and his father, you'll find that piece of oral Torah. Yeah.
So a lot of, I guess, extra stories you hear are from the midrash?
Yes, yes. Now there are two types of midrash. Some of them are halachas, or Jewish laws. Another type is called agadata, which is the type that is the stories. So many of the stories that you've heard, right, about the Torah are midrashim, right? And if you come to a class, the rabbi might say, it says in the medrash, by the way, we sometimes call it medrash, right, or midrash, right? But it says in the midrash, and you think to yourself, I have no idea what a midrash is, but I'll keep listening. Now you know what a midrash is. A midrash is a form of brisa. They are books of collections of oral Torah that line up with the written Torah, right? Okay, and lots of the things. There are children's books called the Midrash Says, right? Well, actually, there are books called the Midrash Says, and then there are children's books called the Little Midrash Says, right? And that's all the things that you always hear about the Parsha, right? And you look through the Parsha and you say, I don't understand. They keep telling me this story, but it's not in there, right? That's why, because it's there. It's in the oral Torah, right? Okay, now again, the Rishonim had access to the oral Torah and the written Torah. And part of what they did was when they read the written Torah, they would tell you what you need to know from the oral Torah in order to understand this part of the written Torah. So for example, if you look at Rashi's commentary on the Chumash, on the written Torah, he's telling you things that he learned from the oral Torah, either from a Midrash or from the Mishnah or from the Gemara. And he is telling you, this is what you need to know to understand this part of the written Torah. Okay, that was one of the roles of the Rishonim, to kind of bring the two together. Okay? Any questions? Yeah.
Do you continue to add the commentary of modern rabbis to the Meorot?
Yes. Right? All the time, new books are coming out, and what they often are is, a book from 1,000 years ago with a new commentary that somebody just wrote. Right? So yeah, you do find it. Yeah.
Who was the first Kabbalist?
So Kabbalah, right?
I know it's not an actual book.
Well, one second. The Zohar, which is the fundamental book of Kabbalah, is part of the oral Torah, right? It was given at Mount Sinai, along with the rest of the oral Torah. It wasn't written down in the Mishnah, most of the Kabbalah. There are a couple of Kabbalistic Mishnayos, but most of the Kabbalah wasn't written down in the Mishnah. Right? It wasn't written down until Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai and Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai came along and wrote it down into a book we call the Zohar. So the Zohar is like the equivalent of the Mishnah, right, for the Kabbalah. But it's all part of the oral Torah that was given by Hashem to Moshe at Mount Sinai. Yeah, okay? All right, so you learned a lot of words today. You know the word Mishnah, you know the word Gemara, you know Mishnah plus Gemara is the Talmud. You know that the commentators were called the Rishonim. You know there was no guy named Rashi. His name was Shlomo, right? And you know there's the Tannaim, the Amoraim. You know what a Brisa is, you know what a Midrash is, right? Not bad for 45 minutes. Okay, Midrash again is collections of oral Torah, Brisas that did not get included in the Mishnah. It's part of the oral Torah, but it lines up with the written Torah. So that's why you hear about it a lot, because it'll line up with this particular verse or particular story in the Chumash. That's where you'll hear the stories that aren't included in the written text. Okay? All right. Thank you for joining us, everybody.
Thank you.
My pleasure.